welcome Nudgestock 22 audience. My name is Jang. I'm the CEO of the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and I'm giving a talk called Behavioral Silence, Open Secrets, Lessons, and Failures from Working in the Global South. First, a tiny bit about Busara, for those that don't know. Busara is a nonprofit. Our mission is to work with researchers and organizations to advance and apply behavioral science in pursuit of poverty alleviation. We've got about 138 staff, 4 decision labs spread across the Global South, done over 500 projects. And what's really nice is we've been in existence for about 10 years, of which I've been in operation for 9. And so I thought I would share 9 lessons with you and 9 failures about working in the Global South. So the first lesson is around failures to hear. What are we not hearing about our work in the Global South? And this is really about our failure to contextualize things and think about whether or not these behavioral biases that we all are well worn and that we use all the time in our work are truly universal or not. So my first story is about what I call the scientist and the butcher. So one of the very first projects we did at Busara was trying to investigate the effect of stress on economic decision-making. So there's a very well-worn paradigm called the Trier social stress test that is known to raise people's both perceived and actual stress levels of the cortisol hormone. And what is it that you do? Well, you actually do a mock job interview, because we found that, at least in the West, that's a very stressful thing. Standing in front of a panel of scientists in fancy lab coats make us feel really stressed and make us feel like everyone's watching us, kind of like how I feel right now. So we tried to do that in Nairobi. We copied it. We got our actors. We got our white lab coats, but it didn't work. We asked people afterwards whether they felt stressed, and they didn't. The numbers didn't show that they're stressed. The cortisol didn't show that they're stressed, and it completely failed. And only after a debrief did we figure out why. And there are 2 issues why. The first one is that Kenyans are very used to public speaking, and they love public speaking. Anyone that's been to Kenya know that no one has a problem getting up at dinner time, speaking about themselves, giving a blessing, giving a prayer. And so that just doesn't, public speaking is not a stressful event for them. It's something that they're used to from a very young age. And the second thing was, one of the participants asked us, all this public speaking is fine. It's not that stressful. But what was really funny is that you had a bunch of butchers in the front of the room. And we thought, butchers, what are you talking about? And it was only after that did we realize that in the communities where we're pulling our participants from, white lab coats aren't, yes, they're associated with doctors and lab technicians, but they're more likely associated with butchers. And so we are inadvertently putting people in these very strange situations. And because we didn't understand the context as well as we should have. The second story I want to tell you is how Preeti was born. And this is about what we like to call, and what everyone should know, is the Linda problem. It's really the representative heuristic. So everyone should know this thing. It's about whether Linda is a bank teller or Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement. The way that you describe Linda, of course, people tend to think that it's more likely that she's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement, even though it's actually mathematically impossible that that's more likely that she's a bank teller alone. We replicated this in the US to great effect, and it didn't really replicate well in Kenya. So when we wanted to see whether it replicated in India, we wanted to create a new Linda, and thus Preeti was born. So we created Preeti. We wanted to see if people thought that it was more likely, after we told our story, that Preeti is a beautician and a community activist, or if Preeti herself was just a beautician. And we couldn't get it to work at all. When we were working within the community, no one would pick any of these options, and all they would say is, Preeti's a mother. Preeti's a mother and wife. And we realized that we put that in the description. And once we put that there, people couldn't get it out of their head that she was a mother and a wife. And of course, a mother and wife is not going to be a beautician or a beautician and a community activist. So we had to go back to the drawing board and recreate Preeti. In our version 2 of Preeti, we got rid of the mother and wife, and we talked about a different story of Preeti. And she was either a garment retailer and volunteered for a local NGO. And only then were we able to actually get back the representative heuristic. So we found through that contextualization process, through multiple iterations, we were able to create a Preeti that was a lot more like Linda. The third story I want to talk about is about the decoy effect. Is it really an effect, or is the decoy effect a bit of a decoy? So what's the decoy effect? Again, this should be well understood, a very classic heuristic here. With The Economist, we have an Economist online subscription for $59. We have the print and web subscription for $1,200. People don't want the print and web until you throw in the decoy of the print only for $1,200. All of a sudden, people gravitate towards the print and web. That decoy that is strictly dominated makes the more expensive option look more attractive. So again, we're able to replicate this in Princeton with other researchers from Princeton University. And but it didn't replicate, and it also replicated in a high income area in Kenya at a local private university, at a rich private university. But it didn't work at all either in Trenton, a low income area of New Jersey, and it didn't work in Kibera, in a low income area of Nairobi. And one of the things that we thought was, well, of course it's not going to work. Do Kenyans even read The Economist? So we actually contextualized this version out to talk about something that they would understand, like airtime and data bundles. But even then, it actually got even worse. And I think since then we've learned that some of these phenomenons when it comes to costs don't really translate, don't replicate across different contexts. Now they might replicate across culture. So if you remember, it did replicate across rich US and rich Kenya, but it didn't replicate across context, low income and high income context. So you have to think really carefully that it's not always just culture that we think about for behavioral biases, but it's about low income and high income context. The next set of stories I want to talk to you is about failure to see. What are we really not seeing when we're designing our interventions? So this is a really quick story about a cute baby. We were working with the Center for Social Behavior Change out of India to create interventions that increase the uptake of iron folic acid in pregnant and lactating mothers. And one of the interventions that we developed was a calendar. Think of it like an advent calendar. The idea is that lots of families in the area that we were working had calendars up on their wall. We thought it would be a really fun thing for them to kind of remember to take an IFA pill, remove a little sticker, and then they would get feedback and they would see some image or some reminder about their growing baby and the importance of taking iron folic acid. So we took this to the field. This was really well received in the area that in the region and with the women that we wanted to work with. You can see the prototypes here on the left and some of the images of us prototyping on the right. But when it came to the final version of the calendar, we were struck with an interesting problem. We assumed that people wanted to see pictures of their own babies, images of Indian babies that look like them. But what we heard very resoundingly was that they wanted to see pictures of white babies, which led to a very interesting and sort of uncomfortable realization that the images that we show people are often the images of the idealized versions of what they want to see. And so are we showing people, are we really helping to inspire people to have healthy babies that really are like them, are in their image, or are we pushing our Western culture a little bit too perniciously on others? In the end, the calendar did work, and I think we ended up with a version with an Indian baby. So all is well, maybe that ends well, but it's a really interesting thing on like, what are we looking at when we're designing interventions? The next story is about when sexual reproductive health might get a little bit too sexual. So we were working with a population of men who have sex with men to try to encourage a dialogue and conversation about sexual reproductive health and eventually create better sexual reproductive health habits, right? And so we thought, great idea. Why don't we create this dialogue through WhatsApp groups? Why don't we create groups where people can talk to each other, share their issues, and we can moderate a dialogue? What we didn't realize was that people would, unmoderated, even with moderation, people would start using it for other purposes. And our WhatsApp kind of eventually became a grinder and it became very not suitable for work. We had to leave the group and eventually delete that account. Again, we don't expect this all to end up this way, but it does show that some of these things are out of your control and you have to think really carefully about before you're designing these interventions. That was a huge failure of ours and something that we didn't see beforehand. And then the final story about interventions I want to talk about is thinking overall, is our intervention a scam? When we're working in the Global South, are our interventions real or are they scams? And of course, they're not a scam, but let me tell you a little story. So when I first started at Busara, we were working with an agriculture insurance product, and we wanted to help launch and increase the uptake of this agriculture insurance product. If you don't know agriculture insurance, the way that this particular product worked was you redeemed it, it monitored where it rained based on satellite data and your location based on your cell phone. And then if it didn't rain at the right time when you planted your seeds, you would get an M-Pesa transfer. You get a mobile money transfer. So it's really kind of magical, right? You don't really have to do anything. And I didn't add, it's a free intervention. So you don't do anything, you give us your number, we know where you are, we measure this rain in your area, and then we send you money if it doesn't rain right. This sounds perfect, but nobody was taking it up and we couldn't figure out why. And then I started thinking, and I was reminded of of this quote in Clarke's third law, which is that any sufficiently advanced technology is really indistinguishable from magic. And I thought, is this really magic, or are we trying to sell people a scam? And so a quick digression. Here's a picture of a scammer, which isn't really a picture of a real scammer. And here's a picture of my grandma, which isn't really a picture of my grandma. But suffice to say, I spent a lot of time trying to convince my grandma not to pick up the phone and not to answer calls from scammers who were promising them some amazing technology, some amazing return, getting rich, or fixing some problem that she may or may not have. And it made me realize that the things that we might be doing when we're working in communities that may not be used to this technology is we might be doing the exact same thing. Is it really any different on what I might be telling a farmer about a technology that knows where he is, can predict where the weather and whether it's rained or not, and send him money through his phone? Is that any different than what a scammer might be selling my grandma? I don't think so. And I think it's something that we really need to think about when we're designing interventions. Are we telling a story that's compelling and reasonable to someone, or are we selling something that's so magical that and so advanced that it just feels like a scam? 3 tips here that your intervention might be a scam, something to think about, both if you're working in the Global South, but other places as well. Are we asking for money up front, like insurance? Give me money and then I promise something good will happen. Is the technology magical, right? I mean, we hear so much about blockchain. We hear so much about chatbots. We hear so much about AI. Is it so magical that it doesn't really make sense? And the third thing is, do we rely on a tell your friend scaling? So much of development is, oh, if you can just get other people to tell other people about it, it'll scale magically. And is that any different than pyramid schemes or multi-level marketing? I'm not so sure. And so maybe a good hint for us when we're thinking about, is our intervention a scam? Can you explain to your grandma, would you let your grandma sign up for something like that? And if you wouldn't, maybe you should really reconsider how you can tell that story and how you can increase the uptake of your product. The final set of stories that I want to talk about is our open secrets, things that we might have in the industry that we really don't want to talk about. So the first one is about diversity and inclusion at Busara. Is it weird that we're mostly Western educated? And so I think people by now know what the weird acronym stands for. It stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And that is to say, right, this is a term coined by Joe Heinrich, that most of social science, most of science, most of research is weird, right? And so when we're thinking about applying these weird concepts into these non-weird places, I think we've got it wrong. And that applies even to Busara and the people that work at Busara. So if we think about weird as Western, educated, that's one thing. But if we think about Western educated as a hyphenated Western educated, I think we have a very different problem on our hands. So some hard numbers. I pulled these numbers today from our HR system. If we have about 75 people at Busara who are managers and above, and I'm using managers and above because below that we can only hire local staff. So this is a relevant distinction. Of that, about 21 of them, or 28% of our staff, are weird. So they're citizens or residents of weird countries, right? And so, even though everyone works in the Global South, people are citizens and from weird countries. And that seems okay. That's kind of like where I would want to see it. We want to have a global and diverse set of people that work at Busara. But that's only weird. If we think about Western educated, actually 60% of our managers and above were educated at one point in their careers in the West. And I think that the fact that that fact really is hidden, and it really belies the fact that we might be just hiring people, even if they might not have the same experiences as us, they might have the same way of speaking, they might have the same way of learning, they might have the same way of communicating. And are we really valuing diversity if we end up hiring people that went to the same universities, the same master's programs, the same PhDs as we did? And so it's a problem that I see at Busara that I'd really like to invest in, so that we have kind of less Western educated and less weird, right? Those things can be very different things. Next story is, why don't people show up to the lab? We do a lot of work with PIs, we do a lot of data collection, and we always wonder, why don't people come to the lab? Why is it that our sessions are always underfilled? A rule of thumb for us is, if you want to get 100 people, data from 100 people, you usually have to invite 200, 100, 250 people to come. And we always wondered why that was. And it took us a long time. It was kind of this open thing, and we made a lot of assumptions. And finally, last year we sat down with people that came to the lab and we asked them, why is it that you don't come? And what it uncovered is a huge gender gap in the real costs of participation. So here are a few quotes. You can pause it if you want to take a look at them. But we noticed that women, they have a huge share of unpaid labor. They have to take care of their kids. They have to do the washing and chores. And they also might have interesting inter-household dynamics. That means that they can't take the time out. They have to they can't walk to the sessions as freely as men can. They have to take public transportation or private transportation. It becomes a lot more expensive. And so the costs of participation aren't always the same. So filling the sessions and making sure that you have equal gender balance means that you have to think about how to encourage that participation or compensate that participation in very different ways. I think this is one of the interesting kind of meta secrets of the meta science issues in social science research, is that participants aren't all equal and we can't all think of them as equal. And then the last kind of open secret that I hear a lot at Busara is, why are you so expensive? And I think the assumption here, we get this a lot from funders and clients and partners, and why are you so expensive? And I don't think that we're more expensive than counterparts in the global north, but I think the open secret here, the subtext is, you work in low-income countries, you should be less expensive. And I actually want to flip that on the head and challenge people to really think about it. What I just talked about, finding really talented staff, right? Where they might be educated and have the behavioral science skills that you can't find in the West. Bringing people and building that infrastructure to get to participants, that's not easy. That's really expensive. And in fact, I would love to see a place where people start to say, wow, that's so worth it, right? It's so worth the investment to do behavioral science here. Here's a few photos of just some of the infrastructure that we've had to build to be able to do some of the testing. It's not the same as it is in maybe the US or Europe, where you can do a lot of testing, maybe over email or sending letters or on an app. These things, we have to set up physical infrastructure. We have to pay people to come in to actually do the testing that we want to see. On the top left, we see an image of our testing infrastructure in Nairobi. This will look very familiar if anyone's been to into a experimental lab in the US or Europe. We create these mobile labs we set up in community town centers and churches, whether it's in Uganda, in northern Nigeria, or even in Fiji. And at the bottom right here, this again was a project we did with the Center for Social Behavior Change. We actually had to rent out a bus, outfit that bus with a bunch of tablets to drive from village to village to get the people that we needed onto the bus. And so this costs a lot of money, and it's a very expensive thing to do. And so I'd love to hear less of why it's so expensive and more, it's totally worth the investment. So really, what have we learned though? I've shared these nine failures and these 9 lessons. What are some of the things we learned? What are the big takeaways, right? I've learned that failing fast means failing forward. So it's okay to fail as long as we're failing quickly and we're learning from it. Something that's really important, especially when you're going to do work in difficult to work settings. Work with what you have. It's really important to make the most of what you have, to really think about being resourceful and not letting constraints bog you down too much. I've alluded to this, listen, and focus on the context. If we're not listening enough, if we're bringing our preconceived notions into it, we're going to fail every time. And if we're not thinking about the context, not just of different cultures, but of different populations, of different incomes, we're going to fail. And so it's really important to listen and pay attention to the context. And overall, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Sure, we call it behavioral science, but it's a little bit messy and we have to be okay with that. At the end of the day, we're trying to make a change, and some of that change is really clean and easy, but most of it isn't. Finally, where are we going? These are things where I think that we should go with this. After 9 years, where do we want to go in the next 10 years? I think I'd really love to see a more indigenous demand for and understanding of behavioral science. I'd like to see really strong and meaningful collaborations between organizations, researchers, and participants. All 3 are really important. And that includes both north-south, south-south, and really south-north collaborations. Think about where those power dynamics are and what kind of collaborations we're funding and what we're really participating in. I want us to be really invested deeply in talent and infrastructure. That's really important if we want to do kind of behavioral science in a really all-encompassing and inclusive way. And then a culture really that rewards processes and results equally to novelty and innovation. So much of work in development is about innovation, but I think a lot of it doesn't have to be. A lot of it is really about process, iteration, getting results, doing a little bit of the dirty work rather than trying to come up with something that's new and innovative all the time. But these are just some of my ideas. Do you have your own secret to share? I'd love to hear it. I have my email down here. Please reach out. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from you. That's all for me. Thank you so much, Nudgestock, and look forward to the conversation.
Channing, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It was so brave and courageous of you to share so many, so many things that hadn't gone quite right. We really appreciate it. I wondered, why did you choose to share your failures with us today?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I really think that behavioral science is, maybe it's not at its absolute peak, but it's really reaching its peak. And I think if we're, when I started, behavioral science wasn't even a thing. People didn't even know what it was. And now I'm meeting undergrads who learned about economics through behavioral economics. That's just such a foreign concept to me, right? That this has now become the norm. Behavioral economics, behavioral science is now the norm on how social science research is done. But with that, there becomes a risk that we get crushed under our own hype as a field, right? If we only are selling our successes, and every organization, everyone has their 3 things that make you sound incredible. We're no different than that. We peddle out our same 3 success stories all the time. But if everyone does that, we're not going to learn, and we risk falling into a hype territory, falling into a failed silver bullet, like many other things and many other disciplines in the past. So I thought it would be really important for us to really start sharing our failures very openly, and not just failures like, oh, failures, haha, we did it and then we fixed it and everything's perfect now, but like actual real, like, we didn't do it right. This is uncomfortable. We don't know where this might go. And hopefully that will spur some conversation. We can learn from other people about their experiences. We can learn what worked for them, what didn't, and we can just move the field forward a little bit.
Yeah, people should share their failures right now with hashtag Nudgestock 2022, shouldn't they? So we can all learn from each other's.
Absolutely.
We've got plenty for swearing there as well, Channing. The second question was, how did you reduce unintended consequences over time? Are they kind of an inevitable thing that's with us forever, or do you have ways of now learning from those things you shared us today?
Yeah, I think some of the lessons highlighted them, but really there are kind of two ways that we've done that. The first one is in investing better in qualitative research and qualitative methodologies, both within the design thinking methodologies, but then qualitative research itself. So I come from an economics background, and when I was doing my work in my PhD, they would call qualitative research anything that wasn't a survey, right? And so you go out to the field, you'd ask someone about how their day was, and all of a sudden that's qualitative research. And who knew there was an entire field of social science dedicated to qualitative research? And so investing in that really helps you kind of avoid really, really huge problems that would stick out in your face. And then the second thing, as I mentioned, is investing in people that know that area really well. So making sure that you're always there with someone that knows the community well, you're entered into the community. They can tell you and help you avoid a lot of the pitfalls early on. And so as we talked about this kind of like weird problem, if we can get people from the community to talk to us and work with us before we even enter, before we even think about those interventions, it really helps a lot. But honestly, I think some of it is inevitable, and that's why you have to fail forward and kind of keep working at it.
I love it. I heard a term for it being known as being flawsome. So this was a flawsome session today. So thank you very much. And you've been very generous in sharing many of your open stories so far. I want to give you a chance to share your best success.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think this is maybe going to be unsatisfactory to people who are looking for an X return or a scale in some particular way. Really, the best success that we've seen at Busara is when people who started at Busara or worked at Busara or an intern at Busara are now working in behavioral science at other organizations. Because that means that our ethos of creating great behavioral science in the Global South really means that we create great behavioral scientists across the Global South. And it's something that I don't think a lot of people appreciate, whether it's a Busara or a JPAL or an ID Insight, there's a lot of capacity that's built up through the work that you do with the talent that you're developing in these different countries. And nothing gives me more pleasure than seeing people at these huge multinational organizations that are now like really at the top of their field that spent some time at Busara and maybe learned a little bit from our experience there. So my greatest success is seeing the talent scale. And that's really ultimately what we think is going to get us to where we want to go, where behavioral science is really well understood across the globe.
Well, Channing, it's been such a thrill to have you with us today. Thank you so much for sharing your failures and the spirit of making this discipline and the world a better place. And everyone should share their failures too. We'll start a failure movement, hashtag Nudgestock 2022, hashtag Flawsome, and we'll collect them today and read them out. Channing, it's been a pleasure. See you soon.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Just one favor. If you want to keep Nudgestock free, click the like button because the algorithm likes it, and click the subscribe button too. The algorithm likes that, and unlike the like button, it's actually useful because you'll get notified of future content from Nudgestock whenever it becomes available.